Today I am going to talk about inclusive instruction and reaching and teaching diverse students, university students. And as Kristen mentioned, I have a lot of experience in researching this transition from adolescence to adulthood, and I tend to focus on more academic, sort of the academic side of that transition. So in school settings, going from high school to university. And in the States, we have two different sets of laws that govern those two systems. So there's some K through 12 special education laws that students with disabilities are sort of they're within that system, and then when they transition to post-secondary education or to university life, they have a different set of laws that applies to them. And so in the States, that's sort of the big, lens that we see this transition through is the changing of the laws and how that changes services and how that changes the rights that the students have moving from high school to college. So that's really kind of where I situate a lot of my research. And I do, well here, who am I? Yeah, you kind of already got a sense for that. I am an associate professor in the NEAG School of Education, and then I do affiliate myself with two research centers there. And my research interests primarily are, like I said, the transition, but then also I've looked quite a bit at university faculty and a group of people that could be very important as facilitating that transition for students, because it's oftentimes university faculty who are potentially the first point of contact or resource for many different kinds of diverse students, not necessarily just students with disabilities, but students from all different groups. It's often faculty, having a student in your class, and that could be the first time that they find out about certain resources that are available at the university that could help them, or any other kinds of interactions. Those interactions are very critical. And so I'm particularly interested in that as sort of like faculty, that interaction between students and faculty, and then also just how raising the awareness of faculty around the diverse backgrounds of their students and how you can help sort of integrate some of that awareness into your own teaching. And so I tend to call that inclusive teaching in a nutshell. Today we're going to talk about a little bit about university. How many of you have heard of just universal design? Raise your hand. Okay, so a lot of you know what this is, and that's very good. And then how about specifically universal design for instruction? Who's heard of that? Okay, almost the same number, maybe a bit fewer. Thank you for letting me know that. I do also, we'll get into, aside from an overview of what it is, which will be very brief, so many of you know what it is, I do also want to give you a chance to give yourself a sense as to whether or not you're incorporating inclusive teaching currently. Many of you probably are incorporating it to a certain extent. And so we're going to do a little self-assessment to kind of see, give yourself a sense for where you're at, which will be nice because then you can get that sense and then go to some sessions today and perhaps be a little bit more selective about which sessions you want to pick and why. And we'll also be talking about examples and tips throughout this process, throughout the keynote today. So this, hopefully you can see this pretty well, but what I have here is an actual exam page of a student. This was many years ago, but this is an actual exam page from an educational psychology exam, and this is a short answer exam. Might be pretty obvious, but basically, I wanted you to look at this because you'll see that you've got pretty standard exam questions, right? It says that top items, it says, well, first of all, there's directions that say descriptions and examples, right? So you know that there's sort of two things that the student is being asked to do here: provide descriptions of a concept and then give examples. Those directions probably could be a bit more clear, but the directions that are on here that we can see is descriptions and examples. So we know there's kind of two parts to a response. And then you'll see item number 30 here. It says an educational principle proposed by Thorndike was, quote, integrated curriculum. Describe this notion and give an example. So pretty standard exam question. Might sound kind of similar to what a question that you might have on an exam. And here you have a student's response. So I'm going to read the student's response. I believe it says, an integrated curriculum helps students to see connections between subjects. Don't study one thing in social studies and another in English. All subjects are seen as related. Studying Indians in social studies, spelling words related to Indian English books are all Indian. I believe that's what the response is, okay? So that's kind of like the gist. Kind of hard to read. One thing you'll notice is some of the words are misspelled and some of the letters are kind of turned around. But in general, we kind of see that the student has a general sense for giving a definition and providing examples. The sentences are not completely written, could be more eloquent, so there's certainly some technical issues there. So here, the reason why I'm giving you this example is, here's an example of how a short answer response might not be the most optimal way for this student to demonstrate their learning on this subject. And it's clear that this student knows something about this concept, but the method in which they're being asked to demonstrate it is not the most inclusive for their learning. And this particular student actually is a student who had a learning disability while they were in college, and so handwriting sort of on the spot in a time situation was a particular barrier for this student. And this student actually is someone who then later received accommodations to type out their responses. And that actually made a huge difference for the student. Also, the student received extended time to respond as well, and that also changed things for that student in terms of being able to respond better, being able to better demonstrate their learning of this topic. But I wanted you to see that because this is an example of what we're talking about, this idea of access. So how are students accessing your courses? How are they accessing the exams in your courses? How are they accessing the content in your courses? And in this example, the exam access for this student was not very good, and there were barriers for the student. So here's just sort of switching gears a little bit. We've got, I'm asking, what is this? So here, everyone's seen these, right? These are on curbs in many places around the city, around just pretty much we see in most new construction, we'll see these curbs, right? So a couple features about these curbs. They're ramps, first of all, so it's easier to step down. And then they're also the brightly colored yellow is a signal of something. It's a signal that you're getting to the edge, you're going into the street. And then also there's a raised texture on that brightly colored yellow rectangle, because if you're rolling over it on wheels or even if you're stepping on it on your feet, you can determine that you're getting close to the edge of the street, right? So there's a couple of features of this to give not just a person with a disability, but also anyone who's using that curb, that makes the curb essentially easier to use, right? So you've got, who does it benefit? So here's one person that would benefit from a curb like that, right? And she's a wheelchair user, so ramps are very important. And then also that raised texture that I was talking about can be very important for wheelchair users to be able to determine how close they're getting to the edge of the curb. And she also has a visual impairment. So that's also important for her to be able to determine how close she is to the edge of the curb. So she would benefit. Can anyone else benefit from just that design? Here's some people that might benefit, right? Might not be people with disabilities, might be people with disabilities. We don't actually know, we can't really tell by this picture alone, but people who use strollers can benefit from that kind of design for the same reasons, really, the safety reasons. Here's some other folks that might be benefiting from that kind of design. And here's some other folks. This person's using luggage, pool luggage. So it's always easier when you're pulling your luggage to have those kind of features as well. And most people use pool luggage. That's not necessarily distinct to a disability. So what we're getting at here is this idea, oh, and also these people might benefit, right? These photos were taken, obviously, in the winter in Boston, so everyone's all bundled up. Those were all those are examples of that curb being universally designed. So those of you who are familiar with universal design, you've probably heard this before, that it has to do with, originally it had to do with at least, the design of products and physical spaces or environments to be usable by as many people as possible. This idea of maximum usability without the need to sort of specially adapt or individually adapt for one person, right? We're trying to be efficient in the sense that it's universally designed so as many people can use it as possible. So with the curb, as many people can use that curb and be safe with that curb as possible because of the different features I mentioned, as far as it being a ramp, as far as it having the raised texture, as far as it having the bright yellow color. That's going to help as many people safely use the curb as possible, regardless of whether you have a disability, regardless of what your diverse characteristics are. So that's really the idea behind universal design, and it's something that came out of the field of architecture in the 1990s, and it really was first applicable to, like I said, buildings, physical spaces. So here's just some examples. Again, this is a similar definition, but that definition is from the Center for Universal Design, which is where it first came out of North Carolina State University. And in these pictures, these are just simply knobs, but they are considered universally designed knobs because in many ways they're a little bit easier to turn. They're a little bit easier to grip than what might be more standard knobs. So those are sort of like accessible knobs and levers. Here's a couple other examples of products that are considered universally designed. So you've got a measuring cup and a salad spinner. Maybe many of you have these at home, right? And maybe you don't even know those are universally designed, but they are. The measuring cup is considered universally designed because you can see the measurement from different angles, right? You can see it from below, you can see it from above. You don't have to hold that cup up right at eye level to see where the liquid line is. So that's considered universally designed because it's usable for people from a variety of perspectives, right? And same with the salad spinner is universally designed in the sense that it's very easy to simply push that middle, large black middle thing down, right? Whereas I think salad spinners from the earlier generation were a little bit more like this, right? So it's a little bit harder. So those are considered some products. And then playgrounds, you may or may not be familiar, but there are accessible playgrounds now. So playground design has sort of gone to the next generation and also takes universal design characteristics into consideration. For example, playgrounds now, typically newer ones have the soft foam bottom, and that's supposed to be easier for impact for kids. They tend to not have as many steps. They tend to have more ramps in their play structure features. All of that is so that kids of many different kinds of physical capabilities can access the playground. So we see this a lot over the last couple of decades. We've seen that products are increasingly more usable in that way. And we also see that there are buildings that may have been constructed before this that sort of have these modifications made to them, partly because laws are in place now, accessibility laws. And so you might notice, for example, that buildings have ramps, right? And a lot of times when you're installing a ramp after the fact, which is the case for a lot of older buildings, that ramp might not be installed right in the front of the building or may not have been a part of the original design of the building. So here's an example of a ramp that's in the back of the building. And it's right next to the accessible parking spot, which is good. That makes sense. But it's clearly in the back of the building. So just thinking about what's sort of problematic about sort of assuming that a person who would have to use a ramp in order to access the building, sort of putting them in the back and having them access the building in the back, what kind of message does that give to wheelchair users or any other users who would need to use the ramp? It sort of gives this message that it's an afterthought, right? So that's one issue with sort of after the fact design that you might see. Here's another example of a ramp that's installed after the fact. This is in the front of the building, so we've moved to the front, so that's good, but you can see just it's visually not that pleasing, and it's clearly after the fact. The nice thing is that the stairs, I don't know how well you can see it, but the stairs here and the ramp are at least together, right? So we're kind of moving in the right direction there. But many buildings, you'll notice that. Older buildings, the ramps were installed after the fact, and the access to the building can be an issue. Has anybody seen this? Can anybody think of some examples of this, either just not necessarily on campus, but just in general that you've seen where there's accessibility ramps sort of that seem to be installed kind of after the building? Raise your hand if you feel like you've seen, you can think of an example of this. Okay, and so think about whether or not just the message I gave about it being an afterthought and who would always have to access the building, maybe in the back or in the side entrance, and who wouldn't be able to go in that front, kind of what message that might give. Here's an example of a museum. It's an art museum where you have a nice integration of the building, the art, and being able to move from floor to floor. The whole building is circular, and it's basically like one giant ramp going up the building. And the artwork is, so anybody can basically go along and view the artwork the same, essentially. There's no special separate entrance for certain groups of people. So here's an example of a very planful design from the beginning where accessibility was sort of maximized and as many people as possible could access the art, essentially. Here's a nice example of a universally designed space. And then here's another interesting example. And in difference, but in this example, I'll just go ahead and answer that question. In this example, you have a really clear integration of the ramp and the stairs. And it's a public. The idea is everyone can access and enjoy this public space, and you don't have to necessarily separate. If you've got two different people, one person who would need to use the ramp, you don't have to separate and go a separate way. You can both enjoy this physical space and this public space together. So those are just some examples of how you might see universal design in public spaces, and maybe you've noticed this kind of design before. And what we want to do now is think about how we can move that same concept to teaching and instruction. So here we have the definition for UDI, Universal Design for Instruction, which is a framework that came about 5 years or so after the original architectural framework came out. So mid-1990s was when it originally came out, and then into the early 2000s. And Stan Shaw and Joe McGuire from the University of Connecticut, who were there before me but are now emeritus professors, they really were the first ones to sort of theoretically introduce this idea that we can take this framework that's now gaining traction in architecture and apply it to instruction. So they were one of the first people to do that, but then also at the same time, some other frameworks of universal design that are similar but a little bit different sort of emerged onto the scene. So you may have heard of universal design for learning. You may have heard of universal instructional design. So it's sort of like UDL, UID, UDI. There's sort of all these different acronyms. And I don't necessarily promote like one specific, one and only framework of these instructional, universal instructional design. I basically think they're all very well intended and trying to give the same message to promote accessibility. So I'm not, even though I'm talking here and giving you the definition for UDI, I will say if you've looked at any of those frameworks, and if you're kind of trying to use any of those frameworks to guide your course design and instruction, then I think you're on the right track. They're all, I think, really good, and they all give the same overall message. So here, this is just sort of like a question to think about. So here you see a physical space where clearly you have a ramp, but then a telephone pole kind of put in the middle of the ramp. So it's kind of like, could you be trying to make your instruction more accessible, but then sometimes there are barriers in the way that maybe you're just not aware of, right? So sometimes you might be well-intended with this, but then you might also be putting up barriers at the same time. So we wouldn't want to see that happen. This is just sort of another metaphor for that as well. We want to avoid that. So these are the 9 principles that Stan Shaw and Joe McGuire originally wrote for the UDI framework. I'm not going to stand up here and read every single one of them to you and just define them. You see them here. Some of you are probably already familiar with them, but what I like to think about when I see these 9 principles is the fact that there's this main idea of access, and those principles promote sort of these 4 areas of access, right? So I'll walk through those areas for you. Basically, there's cognitive, content, communication and networking, and physical spaces. And those really are intertwined throughout those 9 principles. So if 9 seems like a lot, try to think of it in this way. So first, we'll talk a little bit about cognitive access. And so here, there's basically, do you use a range of instructional techniques, materials, and tools that allow students options to demonstrate their understanding and mastery of course content? So what are the different ways that you're delivering the content in your courses? Do you have different modes? Is everything text-based? Are they basically reading all of the information? And that could be online and textbook reading, or it could just be textbook reading. But are they only getting the information one way, or are there multiple ways that they're getting it? Are they using interactive webinars as resources that might have text, but then also might have other interactive video features, or other kinds of materials? So thinking about all the different ways that you are putting your content out there, and then students are accessing it. That is cognitive access, essentially, and that maps onto equitable use, flexibility in use, and tolerance for error, those principles. So a couple things to think about in terms of how you might promote cognitive access. Sort of examples of it are, do you have different exam formats? Do you always give the same kind of exam, sort of like maybe 3 times during the term, or is it varied up a bit? Are there a combination of exams and perhaps take-home assignments? And in that combination, are there different ways that students are responding, or is it pretty much all the same? I know for me, I was an English literature undergraduate major, and so for me, I was always very strong in reading and writing. And so I really couldn't understand why you wouldn't give a reading and writing, like a test that had a lot of reading and writing in it, and I always really preferred short answer paragraph response, because that works well for me. I actually really didn't like multiple choice. So when I first was teaching college courses, I tended to give a lot of short answer item response kind of exams. But that's just one way. That worked well for me, but that doesn't mean it worked well for a lot of students. And in the example I showed you earlier on the screen, the point there was to show that short answer kind of response was really not maximum for that particular learner. So there's many people who would not necessarily benefit and couldn't demonstrate their understanding very well with just that one type of response. So that's just an example. Are you giving different kinds of ways for students to respond? Do you basically provide some type of practice exercises, or perhaps provide old practice tests from other terms, or give students some kind of understanding for what the test might look like, right? Whether it's a study guide, but just some kind of understanding of what it's going to look like for them when they actually are tested. How well is that communicated up front to the learners? That's another example of cognitive access. And so many of you might already do that. You might do study guides, but thinking about how clear the study guide is and how similar the questions on the study guide might be to the actual exam is one thing you might also want to think about. So all of those are examples of cognitive access. So then there's content access. And in this one, essentially, this is where you want to use a variety of instructional techniques, materials, and tools that allow students to be aware of the course content and requirements. So essentially, requirements here, probably this is most relevant to exams, again, but in terms of how you're evaluating your students on exams, how many of you feel like you give clear criteria ahead of time before you start grading for how you might break down the grading of an assignment? So maybe there's points, like if a 5-point response looks like this, a 3-point response looks like this, and that's given ahead of time, preferably in the syllabus, so that students are then using that when they're, as a resource when they're creating their product for you. Does anybody feel like they do that? Raise your hand. Okay, some of you do, some of you don't, and I'm not trying to put people on the spot, but that's an example of how you might provide more content access to students because they understand then what your expectations are. So rubrics are a really good example of this, and I know a lot of people have love-hate relationships with rubrics, and I certainly do as well. I have sort of struggled with using them over years, but I've found that when I have taken the time to use them, it's very clear to the students what my expectations are. And then when I go to grade, it's nice to see that many of them have met those expectations because they had clear directions. So thinking about how you communicate. Everybody grades a certain way and everybody has an idea in their head for what they're looking for when they're grading. And you may even be jotting down notes as you're grading student work about, okay, students are earning extra points if they do this, or these are problems that I'm seeing sort of over many different assignments. Maybe you're even just taking those notes for yourself just so that you are grading consistently. You could take that information and put it in the format of a rubric or just put it in the format of a guideline sheet that you could, next time you teach the course, share ahead of time and say, these were some common themes I saw the last time I gave this assignment. These were some issues that I saw. These are some things that I hope that I don't see this time, right? Just to give the students a better understanding for your expectations, essentially, and how they're going to be evaluated. And so, again, everybody's going to have their own system with how they do this, and I'm not in any way saying you should have this everyone should follow the exact same rubric and it should be very cookie cutter, because I can understand and respect in academia and in university culture that, so much of it is our own sort of way of doing things, and we're all experts in our content areas, and that's how we got here, right? But at the same time, remember that it's part of this mismatch has to do with students' understanding of your expectations. So thinking about how are you communicating those expectations that you sort of automatically apply when grading, how can you do more of that up front? So just think about that for now. And again, I forgot to mention that there's 2 of those 9 principles that would be relevant here, and that's perceptible information and simple and intuitive. Communication and networking is another area of access to think about in your course, and this is defined as the range of instructional techniques, materials, and tools that promote interaction between faculty and students and among students and creates a welcoming and inclusive learning environment. So this is this idea that students come to your class and they bring something with them. Everybody brings something with them that we can all learn from each other, essentially. And so that community building step is very important to do in the beginning. And we probably all do that already to a certain extent. I'm sure many of you probably go around the room and have everybody introduce themselves and perhaps what program they're from or where they're from, depending on what level you're teaching at. If you're teaching a small enough class where that would permit it for. But you probably in some way have some way that students are introducing each other to each other, and you're introducing yourself to them. Are there statements that you could include in your syllabus that are a little more clear about just the community that you're trying to build and the fact that respecting one another and respecting each other's ideas is a value that you want to see in the classroom? Is that in your syllabus, and do you talk about that? Not only on the first day of class, but then talk about it and bring it up again in different ways throughout the course so that students understand that there are these sort of behavioral expectations that you have for them, but also that you're going to show them that you do as well, right? And so it's instructor and students both following those sort of community building activities. So those are different ways communication and networking could come across. If you're teaching online courses, there's ways to do this as well. You might have a welcome discussion board topic in the very beginning of the course where everybody introduces themselves and perhaps includes a picture of themselves so that you can at least put a face to a name, since you can't do that in an online space automatically. But those kinds of small things can really help. It's also important to think about how students might contribute, bring something from their own background to the class. Sometimes that might come through in an assignment. Maybe they might choose a specific topic that they're going to present and go a little bit deeper on to everybody else. But that provides ways in which they can bring something to the classroom. So thinking about, okay, how am I building on what the students already know and bring? It's not just about you as the instructor teaching them. They can teach you and teach each other, and trying to leverage that as best as possible will help you and them in the end. So again, this is community of learners and instructional climate are two principles that this area would hit on. And then physical access is another area, essentially, and this is thinking more about the physical demands placed on learners, so thinking about the physical space that you have to work with. And I know that most of us don't even have a choice as to where we're assigned to teach, but thinking about the physical space and how well students are accessing that space, if you can make some adjustments in it. Also, if you're teaching an online class, how are you utilizing the online space that you have to work with? I know at my campus we use Blackboard. You might not use that here, but I know how to use it very well and like it for many reasons, but one thing that's hard about it is a lot of times materials kind of get lost in this sort of like folder after folder, and it's not actually that easy to find stuff. And so just thinking a little bit about, okay, how would I navigate some of the resources, and if I were coming into this class new, how would I find the syllabus? How would I find the weekly content? Is it that easy to find? That's also an example of physical space. So using online space, using physical space in person, and then if you're using both of those features, if you're teaching an in-person class that has an online part to it, then how are you using that together? All of that would be relevant here. And that maps onto low physical effort and size and space for approach and use. So hopefully that was helpful to think about the 9 principles in those kind of 4 ways. So now what I'd like to talk a little bit about is this understanding around accommodations and modifications. How many of you have received some sort of notification that you have a student in your class that has accommodations? Good, so many of you. All right, and those probably come in the form of like a letter, a formal letter from the Office of Accessibility Services, perhaps, I'm thinking, yes? Sound about right? And what are the kinds of accommodations that you've seen? Anyone want to shout out? What have you seen? More time for tests. That's one. It's used a lot. Yep. Noise canceling headphones. Good, good. Typing a response when everybody else might be handling. I didn't hear that one. Could you say it again? Note taker. Yes, somebody who's in class and takes notes. Getting some materials in advance that maybe wouldn't otherwise be provided in advance. Good. Recording lectures. Pretty typical accommodations. And the intent of all of those is to not change the expectations for the learning. The intent of all of those is to increase access to the content. So I was talking about content access a few slides ago. Those would all fall along the same lines. So getting materials in advance is an interesting one because that could be perceived as potentially an advantage, right? But the idea of that would be that you're basically increasing access for that learner because it's important for them to be able to review the materials in advance. It's probably nice for everyone, though, to be able to review the materials in advance to some extent. So you might also think, how could I be better about providing some more information in advance so that more people can get that information and kind of read it ahead of time and come to class more prepared on that topic. But if you can also have an accommodation for that if you don't normally do that for everyone, that would be the intent, would be to increase the access for that learner. So the idea is that you're increasing accessibility and you're removing barriers. That's what accommodations are. And that is different from modifications. So those might seem like similar words, but in the special education world that I'm very much situated in my research, there's a huge difference. It's a huge understanding about how modifications really do change the expectations of the learning. So this idea that you are making something potentially easier, right? You are reducing some aspect of it in your course, that would be a modification, and you are not being asked to do that. So with any of the accommodations that we listed, the intent of those is not to change the complexity of the content, okay? The rigor of the course is supposed to remain true. So you would never, in theory, then be asked to modify. You would be asked to accommodate, you would not be asked to modify. And so that's how it's been when students with disabilities who have accommodations, that's the idea behind it, right? Is that it's accommodations that increases access. But it's also important to think about how you might take what you've learned about those accommodations and maybe help inform just how you're delivering all of your content to all learners, because the fact is there's a lot of students, university students with disabilities who don't disclose their disability to the Office of Accessibility Services. Did everyone, raise your hand if you knew that. There's people who have disabilities, but they don't disclose them. Good, I'm glad a lot of you know that. So that is a really important point. So that means there's so many students that could benefit from that increased access, but just for whatever reason, they have not registered with that office. And then that could be many, many reasons. There's actually a lot of research to show that this happens. This is a phenomenon. And you know, it could be for many reasons. It could be that students were in the special education system prior to coming to the university and now are sort of, they want to have a fresh start. They want to be able to show that they can do this without the accommodations that they maybe had through schooling previously. So that's a pretty valid reason. You know, you tend to be at a time in your life, you know, around that age where you're kind of ready to do something different and new, and that's just kind of could be part of that mindset. You also just might have students who just might be unaware of the resources. You hope that wouldn't happen. You'd hope that as faculty and as staff on campus that it would be very clear who could go where for additional resources. And I think that for the most part, faculty and staff do an excellent job of trying to promote and put information out there. But the bottom line is there's always some students who don't know, right? And so some students just might not know that they're supposed to go to this office and it's their responsibility to go register. And in the United States, when I was mentioning earlier that there's this difference in the laws, one of the big differences going from that K through 12 system to the post-secondary education system is that students have to self-disclose. So when they come to the university, it's on them to go to the Disability Services office and say, hello, I'm a person with a disability, here's my documentation, I'd like to register with your office. So that sounds pretty straightforward and easy enough, but if you're not used to doing that and you've never had to do that before, then that could be very difficult for some people. So some of it might be that they're aware that it's a resource, but that they simply, they don't know about it, or maybe they know about it, but they just don't know that they're supposed to be the ones to do it, essentially. They're supposed to be the ones to self-disclose. And then there's also the fact that they need most of the time they need adequate documentation. So there's a whole process of reviewing a student's documentation in order to determine if they have a valid disability, if they qualify as an individual with a disability, and that's then what prompts the services and what prompts the letters that you might get for students. So there's a process. And so all of that is supposed to be so that they can access accommodations that they should be afforded as a person with a disability. None of that would mean that they would qualify for any kind of modification. So I just want to be very clear about that. And some examples of kind of reducing the requirements of a task might be to reduce the number of test items, or the reading load, or the reading level of or changing the assignment in some way so that's a specialized assignment for that one individual. You shouldn't be asked to do that when accommodating a student, just generally speaking. That would be considered a modification. So what does essentially inclusive teaching look like? Are you doing it? I talked about how we would do a self-assessment. So I do want you to get out maybe a piece of paper and a pencil, or perhaps a device. And we're going to do a little bit of self-assessment today. And this is based on some work that I've done on measuring inclusive teaching over the last decade. And this is just a kind of a brief run through of some of that work, very briefly. But essentially, early on, I was involved in a model demonstration program at the University of Oregon, where we were it was our goal to sort of shift the campus climate and increase faculty awareness of disability. That was what we were charged with doing. And in that process, we wanted to be able to measure faculty awareness of disability and measure what kind of teaching practices they tended to use. And that's how this inventory was initially developed. It's called the Inclusive Teaching Strategies Inventory. Sometimes I call it the ITSI, because that's the acronym, but that's really where it came from. And since that time, it's been used at a lot of different universities. Kristen mentioned that it's been used in the United States, it's been used in Canada, and it's been used in a couple of other countries abroad as well. And so it's been translated into a few different languages, and that's been really neat. And a lot of that has been other people taking it and asking me for permission to use it, and then them kind of taking it and running their own study with it. So that's been cool to see that happen over the last decade. So we'll go through some items of that inventory together, and I'll have you kind of take inventory of yourself, essentially. But a couple of other things that I've done that Kristen mentioned was, in addition to the creating the measure, I've also done a number of different kinds of faculty workshops at different types of universities in the United States. And so some of the content that I did from the pre-conference workshop yesterday came from some of that work. Also, more recently, I'm working on a project at the University of Connecticut, which we have a session on today, I believe at 10:40, and that's actually, I'm just going to point out, this is Emily Tarkanish, who's a doctoral student who works with me at UConn, and she's going to be presenting that session about how we're using student voice as a teaching tool to help faculty better understand what disabilities are, what they could look like, and then how they could adopt more inclusive teaching. So there's actually a series of videos that we developed that we're kind of trying to integrate at UConn and then measure faculty change before they've watched the videos and after they've watched the videos if their perceptions change. That's just a current project that I'm working on where student voice is very much the teaching tool in that one. So kind of a variety of ways that I've been looking at inclusive teaching currently and in the past. But right now we'll focus on the measure, which is, again, the Inclusive Teaching Strategies Inventory. So I'm going to use a couple of subscales from the measure. And this is a measure where there's a couple of different articles that are published. One is cited here, but that have been published that have looked at the psychometric properties of the measure. So if you are kind of more of a quantitative measurement type of researcher, we have done some psychometric work on the measure, and that's in a couple of different articles, which I'm happy to share with you if you'd want to contact me after. But they were published back in 2011 and 2010 and 2011 primarily, and then a couple of other studies that adapted it for other languages were published later. Okay, so first we're going to talk about inclusive lecture strategies. So again, just get a piece of paper out or a device that you can record on, and we're going to use a scale. So 1 would equal never, 2 equals sometimes, 3 equals usually, and 4 equals always. And so this is like, I do this. You're just kind of rating yourself, how often you do these things, and also how awesome you do them. No, how often you do these things. This is really how frequently do you do this? 1, I repeat the question back to the class before answering when a question is asked during a class session. Do you do this 1, 2, 3, 4? Never, sometimes, usually, always. 2, I begin each class session with an outline or agenda of the topics that will be covered. I summarize key points throughout each class session. I connect key points with larger course objectives during class sessions. All right, so that would be like that set of items is inclusive lecture strategies. So that would kind of be 1 score. So you could add up that score, have like a nice little total, and that's your inclusive lecture strategies score. You don't have to share these scores with anyone if you don't want. It can be very private. Up to you. We'll have a few moments where you can discuss it too. But we're going to do a little bit more with the self-assessment first. So now we're going to talk about inclusive classroom. Again, same scale, 1 never, 2 sometimes, 3 usually, 4 always. I use technology so that my course material can be available in a variety of formats. We've got some examples: podcasts of lecture available for download, course readings available as MP3 files, or other kinds of files. I use interactive technology to facilitate class communication and participation. Like a discussion board would be an example. I present course information in multiple formats. Lecture, text, graphics, audio, visual, hands-on exercises would all be examples of that. There might be other examples that you can think of. I create multiple opportunities for engagement. Again, this is the same subscale, so we're on number 5. I survey my classroom in advance to anticipate any physical barriers. I include a statement in my syllabus inviting students with disabilities to discuss their needs with me. I make a verbal statement in class inviting students with disabilities to discuss their needs with me. I use a variety of instructional formats in addition to lecture, such as small groups, peer-assisted learning, and hands-on activities. I supplement class sessions and reading assignments with visual aids, such as photographs, videos, diagrams, interactive simulations, would be some examples. So that's kind of like your inclusive classroom score, so you could add all that up if you wanted to have like a total score, get a sense for that. Okay, so now we'll talk about course modifications. This is a different subscale. And this, again, same rating scale, 1 through 4. I allow a student with a documented disability to complete extra credit assignments. And you could think of that either as extra credit assignments or different assignments if you feel like you don't do extra credit. 2, I reduce the overall course reading load for a student with a documented disability even when I would not allow a reduced reading load for another student. I reduce the course reading load for any student who expresses a need. I allow any student to complete extra credit assignments in my course, or you could also think of that as a different assignment. So that's course modifications. You can add that score up. And we're not going to share scores or anything. The idea of totaling up a score is just sort of like for yourself to think about and reflect on. But what I'd like you to do, and I already asked you to add up the 3 different scores, but what I'd like you to do is just share your reactions to answering those items with your colleagues at your table. So let's just spend a couple of minutes sharing just some reactions to that. You don't have to share your scores specifically if you don't want to, but just share your reactions to that process. I just kind of wanted to wrap up really quickly. I hope you found that to be useful and at least a starting point for today, because obviously there's a lot of questions that are unanswered that maybe that brought up for you. But the intent of today is to choose where you could go a little bit deeper with your learning, and hopefully you are leaving with that sense. But essentially, the idea here is that UDI and inclusive teaching is the idea that it's going to maximize accessibility but not compromise rigor. I mean, there's other stuff on this slide as well that's important, but that's really the big take-home message, is that we're talking about maximizing accessibility, but we're not talking about compromising rigor. So that you as faculty really do kind of need to find that balance, because you are experts in your field, you're experts in your content area, and so you have a very good understanding of what cannot be compromised, but then how you might be able to provide some flexibility with how students are accessing your course, accessing the exams. So that's what I'm hoping that you can think more about today and learn from and get some ideas on. And just that this approach would benefit students with disabilities and may reduce their need for specific accommodations to a certain extent, but it's not just students with documented disabilities that are registered with the Accessibility Services Office that are going to benefit. It's many different kinds of learners who might not even have that documented disability, but have different kinds of learning needs who would benefit from these approaches. So thinking about just broadly beyond disability is important. Okay, well, that's all I have for you today. Thank you very much. You've been a really, really attentive audience. I appreciate that.